Hello everyone, welcome to the lecture on gender, image and representation. This lecture is part of your paper on media, culture and society. This lecture will make you rethink the concept of gender by looking at it from the perspective of gender relations and not necessarily through a distinction between sex and gender. It will discuss the concept of gender from an Indian perspective where it intersects with caste, nation, religion, age and region. The cultural texts of gender are used and interpreted by the media, thereby reinforcing and reproducing the gender relations more robustly in the society. This lecture further discusses how media indulges in politics of representation by stereotyping women into fixed categories. Reflections on the concept of gender. The concept of gender has been used in at least two very different and indeed somewhat contradictory ways. On one hand, the term gender originated as a contrasting category to sex, to depict that it is a socially constructed gender as opposed to something which is given biologically. On the other hand, gender has been increasingly used to refer to any social construction dealing with the male-female distinction, including those constructions that separate male bodies from female bodies. Therefore, it would not be wrong to argue that if the body is seen through social interpretation, then sex is not something that is separate from gender, rather is subsumable under it. This becomes a valid argument against the distinction between sex and gender. Now, understanding gender in Indian context. In India, the issue of gender has entered the lexicon of feminist struggle through a very different trajectory from that followed in the West. Historically, the women's movement in India can be classified into two phases. First, as part of the nationalist struggle, a period of reformist movements when first men and later women took up women's issues. Many women's organizations also emerged, spearheading the struggle against social evils and advancing the cause of female education and female franchise. After a long gap, a second and more militant phase of women's organization emerged in the 1970s, which directly challenged the patriarchal social order while rallying around issues of violence against women like dowry deaths and rape cases. Thus, it follows that in India there are no references to theoretical perspectives in themselves, rather more women activism defines, articulates the issues that frame the problem. Indian feminists also thought of gender as a social construction, but the recognition that gender is historically and socially constructed is not sufficient. So what they offer instead is the notion of gender relations. The concept of gender relations implies that the categories men and women need to be analyzed in their relationships not only at the level of culture and ideologies, but in a range of disparate but articulated contexts and situations. So here we find the notion of gender emphasizing not only roles and identities but also relationships with other categories like caste, class, religion, etc. The Western notion of gender, as Mary John argues, still remains a donor category which has to make its mark here in India. Now, gender, nation and women's movements in India. There has been a conflation between Indian nation and Indian women during anti-colonial struggle. Women were mobilized in large numbers to take part in the public sphere and became the site to contest colonialism. Women were persuaded to view themselves as capable of a greater virtue than what their nature allows them. This discourse privileged women as the repository of true Indian culture and moral power, uncontaminated by westernization or other ranges of history. After independence in the 1970s, the women's movement was termed as the second wave feminism in India. There was a shift towards a predominantly feminist agenda, with the problems of rape, dowry deaths becoming the major issues of concern. The Indian women movement in this sense is a collection of several smaller movements which have grown out of a series of spontaneous reactions against injustices of which they have been victims throughout the centuries. No doubt the term patriarchy, men as the principal oppressors, comes to explain the subordination of Indian women. But Uma Chakravarti warns that patriarchy in the Indian context has to be situated in its relationship to other structures like caste, class, community and tribe, and also within a historical context. Suma Chetnis in 2004 similarly argues that in India, patriarchy is only one from among the several hierarchies that oppresses women. Some of the most oppressive of these are the hierarchies of age, of ordinal status, of relationship by marriage. In support of her argument, she points out that most women in India experience family violence as the cruelty of the mother-in-law or the husband's sister. This brings out the problem in taking that notion of patriarchy which solely held men to be the oppressors. Another relevant point that needs to be mentioned here is the tradition, modernity debate in which the Indian woman was located. The impact of modernization on women was that it invariably concentrated on the role conflict of the middle class working woman. So, women began to have access to formal education and employment, and consequently there emerged a struggle to get away from Western notions of independent, career-oriented women because it was perceived to be a threat to Indian identity. So, the women, although had access to education and employment, were tied to familial norms through the institution of marriage. And there was the construction of a new woman who was educated, employed, but still looks after her family. There was a proliferation of images of a new liberated woman who are still grounded in tradition. And what clearly emerges from the above account is that the notion of selfhood could not be applied to the Indian woman. As Kumkum Sangari rightly remarks when she argues that the notions of femaleness, self or identity are so tied up with questions of family, class, religion and other forms of collectivity that they cannot be framed in terms of a single unified axis. Thus, Indian women could never be seen as independent and are always related to family, class, caste, nation and religion. Now, gender and media representations. There are certain institutions involved in the process of construction of gender, the media being one of the most important ones. The media, through its images, represents gender. And the main aim of the following discussion is to show that the study of representation of gender must take into account certain questions as where do images come from? And who produces those images? How meaning is closed on in representation? Who is silenced in the production of images? Who are representations addressed to or aimed at? And what is at the stake in representations? The answer to all these questions brings out the issue of politics of representation. The stereotypical portrayal of women is a result of this politics and an interplay of power and ideology. Spivak 1988 considers representation as both a political and cultural vice. This combined approach to the concept of representation is highly fruitful in that it avoids some of the naivety of earlier sociological approaches to representation, in which there was the underlying assumption that there was a real woman out there, that the media had the possibility of and responsibility to know and present. In other words, what gets represented in media is drawn from the culture but articulated in order to serve the interest of certain ideologies. In this context, representation performs the function of myths, and Rollabath argues that myth transforms complex historical process into shorthand then appears to be natural. Those who internalize these messages from media actualize them in their daily activities, thereby reproducing the dominant ideology, although the possibility of different readings of the same text is always there. So now the representation, the concept in media studies. Representation means to present or depict something. The idea of representation as the representation of the world emphasizes the process of construction within any text. Representation for us then refers to the construction in any medium, especially the mass media, of aspects of reality, such as people, places, objects, events, cultural identities, and other abstract concepts. Such representations may be in speech or writing as well as still or moving pictures. The term representation thus refers to the processes involved as well as to its products. In this sense, we can understand representation as a medium in that it stands between the real and the reader of the media text. Representation constructs the reality it appears only to describe. And it should be noted, however, that representations which become familiar through constant use come to feel natural and unmediated. The boundary between the reality and fiction becomes progressively vague or blurred. So what needs to be borne in mind is that the media offers us a representation of reality rather than reality itself. If such is the case, then the question arises, in whose interest is it that the representation is made in a particular way? This brings us to the issue of the politics of representation, gender and politics of representation. So what does this basically means? Like representation, gender, when considered from a conventional heterosexual perspective, is also a two-part structure involving the differentiation between men and women. The most typical problem presented by gender is that one term in the binary structure, male, is usually taken as the authentic origin and standard by which the second term, female, is judged and found to be deficient. Needless to mention, media plays an important role in the reiteration of this heterosexual ideal through representation of women and men, which attempts to fix the fluidity of meanings that surrounds femininity and masculinity. Many objects, not just humans, are represented by the media as being particularly masculine or feminine, particularly in advertising. And as we grow up with an awareness of what constitutes appropriate characteristics for each gender, it is undeniably that the media shapes our conceptions of what it means to be male or female. And the gender politics are absolutely central to the very project of representation. In men's act of representation, women are often used as symbols for meaning men want to convey. And women, in the other words, have been objectified as the very devices of representation and as the signs that bear specific moral or artistic significance in a world created by men. Here, sign is taken to be any item which can produce a meaning, and the meaning of a sign is determined by its relationship to other signs in the sign system, defined in other words by what it is not, viewed in this way, woman then has meaning not because it refers to some real pre-given entity that the world tags, but because it is different from another sign, man. It is therefore possible to see woman not as a given biological or psychologically, but as a category produced in signifying practices. And woman then stands in a patriarchal culture as signifier for the male other, bound by the symbolic order in which man can live out his fantasies and obsessions through linguistic command by imposing them on the silent image of woman, still tied to her place as bearer of meaning, not maker of the meaning. And this gives us the insight that gender is a semiotic system, a system of meaning based on difference between men and women. And it thus reveals the hegemonies and asymmetries of power between men and women. We need to reveal the way in which the dominating male gaze, carrying with it social, political and economics as well as sexual power, relegates women to absence, silence, marginality, using a series of increasingly vicious mechanisms. And one such mechanism is the process of stereotyping of women that is discussed in detail in the next section of the lecture. So now we will shift to stereotyping as a politics of representation. Stereotypes function by simplifying, by reducing classes of people to a few characteristics by which they are generally said to be identifiable. In other words, stereotypes function by simplifying, by reducing classes of people to a few characteristics by which they are generally said to be identifiable. In other words, a stereotype is a radically reductive way of representing whole communities of people by identifying them with a few key characteristics. And these characteristics are often exaggerated and the entire group becomes rendered to single characteristics. Thus, stereotyping reduces, essentializes, naturalizes and fixes differences, and through the operation of power marks the boundaries between the normal and the abject. A postcard from the 1900s depicts a white man kissing a black woman with the verse, "Not particular. I know you are not particular to a fault, though I am not sure you will never be sued for assault. You are so fond of women that even a wench attracts your grossy fancy despite her strong strength." Coming to terms with gender stereotypes, research on the visual representation of women has shown that women were shown as either overwhelmingly domestic creatures, housewives, mothers, or as sexual prizes and accessories to men. Assistants to male authorities, the few older women represented tended to be figures of fun, while women from ethnic minorities were visible at all, tended to be shown in highly stereotypical ways. So, the normal femininity has been depicted as overwhelmingly young, slim, white and heterosexual and domestic. And the potential consequences of this were highlighted by Gay Tuckman in 2000 in her well-known article with the striking title, "The Symbolic Annihilation of Women by the Mass Media." In these words, from children's shows to commercials to prime-time adventures and situation comedies, television proclaims that women don't count for much. They are underrepresented in television's fictional life, they are symbolically annihilated. It wasn't just a problem of numbers either. Tuckman asserts that those women who were shown to be working were portrayed as incompetent and inferiors, as victims or having trivial interests. Even in women's traditional domain of the home, men were shown solving both emotional and practical problems, leaving women with little value in the US television world. Similarly, Indian television advertisements in the late 1980s exhibited many of the same formats and patterns of gender portrayal that American advertisements do, sometimes with nearly identical frequencies. And as discussed in the previous section, women in Indian society were always tied to the notion of family, nation, thereby denying them selfhood. This is also reflected in the representation of women in Indian television advertisements, where women are shown mostly as mothers, wife, a daughter-in-law, basically a homemaker who selflessly engages herself to maintain her responsibilities towards her family and also to her nation and country. And according to Krishnan and Digge in 1990, the representation of the idealized woman on Indian television as subservient wife is embedded in and drawn from the Hindu Dharma Shastras, religious codes or sources of tradition and right conduct such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They argue that the two main trends were evident in their study of the representation of women on Indian television, those of affirmation and denial, where affirmation implied a limited definition of womanhood as passive and subordinate, being tied to housework, husbands and children. And denial existed in terms of the creativity, activity and individuality of women, particularly in relation to work and the public sphere. Women were further stereotyped, they argued, into the idealized and deviant. The ideal woman was caring and maternal. She was supportive of men in their ambitions but had none of her own, being sacrificing, empathic and home-centered. As a passive wife and daughter, she accepted male control and was devoted to the men in her life. Whereas, on the other hand, deviant women were domineering of their husbands and did not remain at work to look after the family. And rather than having personal ambitions, they broke up family ties, disrupted male bonding, and were not understanding or accommodating enough. In contrast, masculinity is a concept that is made up of more rigid stereotypes than femininity. The normal masculinity has been seen as less restricted and more often associated with power, action and control, thereby shown to be more active, decisive, courageous, intelligent and resourceful. And such stereotypes prevail due to the interplay of power and ideology of certain institutions, market and states, concealing the operation of power within society by characterizing inequalities as natural differences of ability or inclinations. One of the main attributes of stereotyping is its relationship to the maintenance of certain relations of power. The media, being the child of state and market, perpetuates these differences so that there would be no threat to the society, thereby privileging the male. The readers of these texts try to actualize them in their real lives and further internalize this inequality of difference between men and women. Now then, Moso, your form is of the manliest beauty and you are altogether a most attractive object, but you have stood there long enough, so jump in and have done with it. Now shift to the representation, power and ideology. The stereotypical representations can be seen as reflecting the power relations operating within our society. This idea finds expression when we look into the disputes over Western representation of non-Western people. The most appropriate example of this is the habitual portrayal of third world women as victims of their own societies by Western feminist scholars. And another glaring example that supports this point, that stereotypical representations reflect the power relations operating within our society, is Larry Gross' 2001 groundbreaking article on sexuality and representation, wherein Gross examines the media as an institutionalized apparatus with the authority to define and frame sexuality. Particularly in the case of representation of gay and lesbian people, the media works to symbolically annihilate their lives. The stereotypical depiction of lesbians and gay men as abnormal and the suppression of positive or even unexceptional portrayals serve to maintain and police the boundaries of the moral order. This shows, however, heterosexuality is shown to be normal and desirable, which in turn serves the ideological function of gender. One way in which ideology works through media texts is by simple process of repetition. And this process of repetition is particularly true of repeated representations across media forms, which can have the effect of naturalizing a way of seeing an issue so that it seems that no other interpretation is possible. And this might serve to be an explanation or understanding of the stereotypical representations of women in India. And in this context, the ideological work of the media is such that women are represented repeatedly as subordinate to women so as to accept this subordinate position as being both natural and inevitably and in some way right. In other words, the ideological function of many media texts then was to identify for women how they should perform within a patriarchy. And the example is the ideology of Grihapatni, which later formed the basis for the concept of Pativarita, is reflected in the portrayal of women in television advertisements in India as a homemaker, which serves the interests of patriarchal ideology. The media text in this sense is both the container and the disseminator of ideology. While concluding, let us now quickly recap what we have learned in this lecture. To sum up, it is the power dynamics between men and women embedded in our culture, which we internalize through socialization, which controls not only media production of images but also interpolates the readers of the media text as subjects. And in this way, media reproduces the gender relations. And in the stereotypical representation of women, media pass on society's heritage, which is deeply sexist, in order to secure continuity, integration, and the incorporation of change. For example, in India, the anti-pornography campaigners argue that the media serve the needs of patriarchy by representing women as objects and by suppressing women's experiences. We hope that you are now clear with the concepts of gender and representation. Please read the e-text carefully for more details and attempt all the questions given in the end. And for more information, please refer to the reading list provided with the e-text. Thank you.